Chapter 8. The ambulance came first, stopping with a startling shriek of brakes. Paramedics on board donned wet suits to retrieve the victim from the cold, rough waters. A police car arrived almost simultaneously. 2 officers got out and made their way down the slope to where Mitch and Scott were still standing. Margaret gave Lucas and David a lot of credit for their ability to hold Michael back. He wanted desperately to run down to the water, but the 2 boys wouldn't let him. They had to physically restrain him, talking to him in urgent tones, until he sank down on the top step in defeat, all the fight drained out of him. Once, Margaret thought she heard him murmur, "It's my fault. It's all my fault." But she knew she must have misunderstood. Michael had been playing ball when that scream sounded. He hadn't been anywhere near the lighthouse. The wait seemed to stretch on forever. Only the sun poking in and out among the clouds provided a smattering of warmth from time to time. They had inadvertently divided into 2 slightly separate groups. The larger group Michael, surrounded by his friends, the other Margaret and her friends. They huddled there, trying to keep warm, anxiously awaiting some sound, some signal that Stephanie Markham was no longer being brutally battered against the rocks. The tension was broken first by the sound of voices approaching from behind the lighthouse. The group on the steps stood up, all faces filled with dread except Michael's. Margaret could tell, when she glanced at him, that he was still holding out hope. "Because he hasn't seen what I saw," she realized. "He still doesn't believe she's dead." The 2 policemen appeared around the corner of the lighthouse first, immediately followed by a rubber-suited EMS worker carrying a stretcher. On it lay a black plastic body bag, carefully zipped completely shut. A second wet-suited man was holding the other end of the stretcher. It was a sight no one standing on the lighthouse steps would ever forget. The black zippered bag told the whole story. Stephanie Markham had not survived that cold, battering surf. It wasn't even likely that she had survived the fall from the deck. Michael let out a sound and dropped to the steps, his head in his hands. Bate and Kiki burst into tears. Lisa muttered something and leaned against the building, her hands over her mouth. Lucas and David stared silently at the gruesome body bag, as did G9 and Lacey. Mitch and Scott trailed behind the stretcher, their faces grim. While the stretcher was loaded into the ambulance, the 2 officers approached the group frozen on the steps. One policeman whipped out a small notebook and a pen. He was kind enough to wait until the ambulance departed before saying, "Sorry, folks, but I'm going to have to ask a few questions here. Anyone see what happened to that girl?" The second officer made his way through the group, yanked open the lighthouse door, and disappeared inside. His heavy footsteps, clanking up the metal stairs, echoed in the cool air. The officer still outside took names, telephone numbers, asking for photo IDs, then asked each person if they had seen or heard anything. Only Mitch and Margaret had heard the scream. The officer asked what time they had heard it, and then jotted down the time. Then he asked each of them where they had been at that time. Margaret wasn't really listening to the answers. She couldn't get the sight of that black rubber body bag out of her mind. She was vaguely aware of answers like picking flowers in the woods, hiking along the North Shore, playing volleyball, in the restroom, in the parking lot, even, I dunno, just sitting, I guess, but wasn't aware of which person gave which answer. It didn't really seem to matter. Unashamed tears slid down Michael's face. "You the boyfriend?" the officer asked, moving to stand in front of Michael. "You up there with her when she fell?" "No, if I had been, I wouldn't have let her fall." Michael sounded angry. "How come you weren't with her?" Margaret stared at the policeman. Good question. She would never have thought of asking it, but she had never, ever seen Stephanie Markham alone. If she hadn't been with her 3 best friends, she'd been with Michael. At school, at the mall, at the movies, at dances and parties. There were rumors that he wasn't the most faithful person in the world, but they'd never ended the relationship. So why wasn't he with her when she climbed those lighthouse steps? Michael didn't answer right away. The officer had to ask the question a second time. We had a fight. I mean," Michael added hastily, "not a real fight, just a little argument, really. I wanted to play softball and she didn't. Said she'd get all sweaty. She got mad and took off. I played, and when the game was over, I went looking for her. Couldn't find her. Then that girl, pointing to Caroline, came running into the park saying something terrible had happened. I knew right away she meant Stephanie, because Steph hadn't come back. A fight. It struck Margaret that the officer hadn't heard a single word after that first sentence. You fought with the dead girl. At the phrase, dead girl, everyone in the group shuddered. They were nowhere near ready to think of Stephanie Markham as the dead girl. It wasn't a fight, Michael persisted. Margaret thought she heard fear in his voice. She'd be scared, too, the way that policeman pressed for answers. Everyone knew Stephanie and Michael had argued a lot. Big deal. That didn't mean he'd pushed her off the top of a lighthouse. Pushed. The thought stunned Margaret. No one had said that Stephanie was pushed. The railing had broken while she was leaning on it, and she'd fallen to the rocks below. That was all. Wasn't it? Oh, Margaret, her inner voice said, you don't believe that for a second. You never did. Not after Mitch and Michael told you Stephanie wouldn't have gone up to the lighthouse alone. Isn't that why your stomach is in such an uproar? No, Margaret argued with herself. No, that's not true. I don't want that to be true, any of it. It's too horrible. But she hadn't convinced her stomach. It continued to churn like the waters that had trapped Stephanie. The second officer emerged from the lighthouse, holding something up in the air for his partner to see. Margaret couldn't see what it was. It didn't look very big. It seemed, in the dim light, to be shiny and small. An earring. Something of Stephanie. She took a step closer. Her eyes, like everyone else's, were on the object in the officer's hand. It was a pin. A small, silver pin. 4 musical instruments joined together to create a quartet. quartet. It was one of the pins Adrian gave away as souvenirs at the store, so that our customers won't forget us. Anyone know whose this is? The officer asked. Found it up there on the floor, right next to the railing. Margaret frowned. She had never, not once, seen Stephanie Markham wearing one of the quartet pins. She wore only gold jewelry, very expensive gold jewelry. She might have taken one of the souvenirs just because they were there, but she would never have been caught dead. She would never have worn it. Oh, we all have those, Bates said, her voice still choked with tears. They give them away at quartet. Everyone in town has one. Yes, Margaret thought, but not everyone wears them. Stephanie wouldn't have. She said so then, aloud. Stephanie wouldn't have worn one of those pins. She only wore gold jewelry. Right, Michael. He looked blank for a moment, and then his expression cleared, and he nodded. Right, gold. She didn't like the cheap stuff. Wouldn't wear it. So that's not hers, Margaret told the officer. It's someone else. And she hesitated. When she spoke again, she was really only thinking aloud. The first time I was up on the deck this afternoon, she mused slowly, thoughtfully. That pin wasn't on the deck. I would have noticed it. My mother runs the store that gives them away, and I work there, so the pins mean a little bit more to me than they would to someone else. If one had been lying on the deck, I would have noticed. The officer looked skeptical. Maybe you're so used to seeing these pins all the time. One could have been right under your nose, and you wouldn't have paid any attention. That's probably true when someone's wearing one, Margaret agreed. I guess I don't always notice when a pin is on a blouse or sweater or blazer. But if one had been lying at my feet when we were up on that observation deck, I would have bent and picked it up, the same way I would in the store. It wasn't there, officer. One gray, bushy eyebrow lifted. I thought you said you were up there. Sounded like you meant alone. Margaret felt her cheeks redden. I was alone, at first. But then he came up, pointing half-heartedly to Mitch, wondering if he'd be mad that she'd brought him into the discussion. So I wasn't alone when I came back down. You and Mitch, Bate asked, astonishment in her voice. At the lighthouse. Margaret felt all eyes on her. She knew her face was flushing and felt defensive. Since when was it a crime to run into someone on the observation deck? The officer turned his attention to Mitch. You see anything? No, sir. Didn't notice the pin lying on the deck. No, but it could have been there. It's pretty small. Probably wouldn't have caught my eye. I wasn't looking at the floor. There must have been a lot of people up there today, Scott interjected. What with the picnic and all? That pin could belong to anyone, like Bates said. A tearful Bate nodded. So did the police officer. End of story, Margaret thought. And he was probably right. The pins were so commonplace. Anyone could have dropped one. But she was still convinced that it had been dropped sometime between her first trip up there and her second. You kids aren't supposed to come near this place, the officer said sternly. Can't you read that sign? It's there for a reason. He shook his head. takes a terrible tragedy like this, a fatal accident, before you people take warnings seriously. Think you're invincible, but you're not. I guess you know that now, right? When they were allowed to leave, they walked in a stunned silence up the road toward the parking lot, anxious by now to get as far away from the point, the lighthouse, and the park as possible. Margaret, walking between Scott and Caroline, tried to focus on the officer's lecture. A fatal accident, he had said. She wanted to believe that more than anything. But everyone who knew Stephanie kept insisting that she wouldn't have gone to the lighthouse alone, or gone up the stairs to the observation deck. And there was that pin. If Stephanie hadn't been wearing it, who had? Margaret wanted to stop thinking about it, but she couldn't. Her mind raced onward without her permission, a rebellious child out of control. What if Stephanie hadn't gone up there alone? What if she'd gone up there with someone? Then that someone would have helped her, would have kept her from falling somehow. And if they'd failed, and she'd fallen anyway, they'd have come racing back up the road to the park telephone to shout for help, like Scott had said. They would have reported the accident, but no one had done that. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Impossible that someone could have witnessed that fall to the rocks and done nothing. Someone like that would have to be totally, completely heartless. No, worse than that. Someone like that would have to be totally, completely sick. How else could someone watch what had happened to Stephanie on those rocks, and then return to a picnic to eat hot dogs and drink soda and play volleyball or softball and laugh and talk, just as if everything were as normal as it had always been? It wouldn't have been for long, because Scott and Caroline must have come racing back to the park shortly after Stephanie fell. But still, how could someone do that, even for a short while? The image was so sick, it made Margaret dizzy. Her head ached fiercely. Either there had been no one on that observation deck when Stephanie fell to her death, which was what Margaret wanted fiercely to believe, or there had been someone there, because Stephanie would never have gone up there alone. If there had been someone up there, Margaret didn't want to think about how sick or evil that person had to be.